Just imagine this scene, right, of these are open carts.
That's right.
And here you're just witnessing these nuns dressed in their habits, chanting these Latin hymns, being led to their death.
It's fidelity against fanaticism. These people were faithful to their calling in life, regardless of all the pressures that were coming at them from all sorts of angles.
Praise be Jesus Christ, and welcome to another episode of CarmelCast. CarmelCast is a production of the Institute of Carmelite Studies Publications. For more information, you can visit our website at icspublications.org. In this episode, I'm very pleased to be joined by Father John Sullivan, a Discalced Carmelite friar who lives here with us in Washington, D.C. And Father John is currently a scholar at the Center of Carmelite Studies at Catholic University here in Washington, D.C. And he's a member of the Scholarly Advisory Board at the Theresianum Journal, which is a part of the Theresianum faculty in Rome. And also, Father John studied for his doctorate at the Institut Catholique in Paris, which is particularly important reason why he's here with us today because of his experience spending time in France. Now, Father John is really, I'd say he's an expert on one of our other saints, Saint Edith Stein.
Oh, yes.
Yes, but also very knowledgeable on all things Carmelite. So we're very happy to have you with us here, Father John.
It's good to be here.
Good. So the topic of this episode, really, I wanted to talk a little bit about these newest Carmelite saints of ours. As of December 18th, Pope Francis canonized 16 new Carmelite saints. And these are the Martyrs of Compiègne, as they're known. French Carmelite nuns who were killed during the Reign of Terror. And so in this episode, we're really going to talk about some of their historical context, their life, their death, and then, of course, their enduring legacy even on to today. So I thought maybe we could start with a sort of overview of the time period in which we're going to be talking about where the nuns were living.
That's great. Yeah. Well, they are martyrs because the French Revolution broke out. The starting date being the taking of the Bastille, which was a prison. That was July the 14th, 1789. But there were factors that were leading up to why there was a revolution in the first place, you see. What happened was that there was a certain kind of stagnation in Europe in the 18th century, the 1700s, on the monarchies. They had, unfortunately, taken to fighting back and forth over territories and also lineage, whether or not they had they would have a male heir or not, and there'd be all sorts of difficulties. And as a result, they emptied their coffers. They were running out of money. And so taxes grew higher on the people below them. They had in their courts a lot of nobility, but those people, they didn't pay the taxes. They accepted them from the serfs and the other working class people. They weren't all serfs at the time because previous to that time in the late 1700s, you did have the middle class coming up, the so-called bourgeoisie. And these are people, tradespeople, artisans and all that. So they were actually a part of the newer phenomenon, which was certainly a couple of hundred years old, of the concentration of people in cities. See, it wasn't just agriculture. But the agriculture was another problem for the coming of this revolution. There was a lot of difficulties with the harvests. People were not really making a very good living off the land. And then that bumped up against other things like supplying food to those cities. And people associate with the French Revolution a definite lack of enough bread, with the infamous remark that it's probably not real, but they ascribe it to Marie Antoinette when the people were outside the palace complaining, and she was saying, well, what in the world is worrying my people? And they said, well, Your Majesty, they need bread. And she says, they need bread? She says, well, so how bad is that? Oh, it's terrible they don't have it. Well, if they don't have bread, let them eat cake. Now, the reason why that is probably just, legendary is that the term used is brioche, and brioche is not exactly cake. It's a sort of a sweet bread. But at any rate, there was real problems with supply. We would call that, supply lines today, just to keep people eating properly. And so there was a lot of resentment against the monarchy. And they weren't doing a good enough job, one would think, to realize that it was a very serious undercutting of the influence that they had on their people. Okay, that's one thing.
Yeah, maybe if I could just make a quick comment there. It seems like
sure.
there was this kind of rising class distinction that was happening in France, but particularly the lower class were in a time of great suffering.
That's correct.
And even some of perhaps the middle class, while the royalty, even some of the the church, like were seen as kind of they were eating well, while
Correct.
the others were suffering.
Yeah. That was something I was going to add in. You see, using the terminology of the times, they had 3 estates in the country. You see, you had, and it was like a pyramid. Pyramid with smaller groups at the top and then the big at the bottom. The top, actually, by tradition, they put the clergy, all right? Then came the nobility. So those are the people who had the money and would collect the taxes from the people on their estates. And then you had all the other people. They would be, farmers, but then the bourgeoisie as well, see, the people who didn't belong to the nobility. And there was a little bit of you could say, a double whammy. All the bishops in the clergy, and clergy would include religious, by the way, so we Carmelites would have been part of that, and also women religious as well. But you see, the double whammy was that every bishop had to be a noble. So they would get making money from the church and also from their own estates, you see, that type of a thing. So what happened was you had a growing number, though, of the people who were sweating it out, trying to get enough taxes into the king so he could then have another battle using their sons to go fight the neighbor next door, perhaps, you see, because of these dynastic troubles and all the rest. And then there were also, in part, wars of religion. Okay, let that go. So the thing is, the 3 estates formed what was called then the Ancien Regime, the old order. And what was going on was that in the realm of ideas, you had this thing called the Enlightenment. These are people who were working to get you would say, for the times, a modern approach to reality. You'd have to say backing up away from what the Middle Ages had given them, see, and based on things like piety, logic. They're talking about mathematics, science. There's a big push towards science in the century beforehand, and then also in the realm of ideas, it had to be experiential. It wasn't just taking theorems from the past and passing them and repeating them. I'm being very, very brutally simplistic about this. A philosopher would say, well, you could speak it a little bit nicer than that. But at any rate, there was a ferment there, and what they wanted a lot of, the Enlightenment people, was greater freedom for thought, freedom for action. And they were finding that in the ancient order, the old order, the ancient regime, what they had to do was knuckle under, because the king was in charge. And not only was he in charge, he was by divine right. And so you were not supposed to question this. This is what God wanted. You could to borrow a phrase from the Middle Ages, Dieu le veut, God wants it. You know, that was when they went to war. But the thing was, God wanted the order as well. I mean, these people were starting to challenge all that.
Yeah. What role then, or how was the church then seen kind of in the midst of all this? I mean, you mentioned, the church was there at that highest estate, but what was then the view of the people who are kind of building up this revolution? How did they view the church and those people, the bishops?
Oh, they'd be very happy to see that it would lose its possessions and its privileges. And they considered them privileged. We would be considered not on the side of the good guys, really, as a group, if only for the fact that, and I saw this once when I took a pilgrimage to France, the Carmelite order had a lot of friaries and many monasteries of nuns, and a lot of that came with real estate. One of the monasteries in Bordeaux, for instance, with the other Carmelites, not the Discalced, it was an immense city block long, near the church where today the body of St. Simon Stock is preserved. Okay, that's another question. But the thing is, well, it's Carmelite and the scapular, nice. But you see, they were they were part of the power on top of everybody else, not necessarily down with them. We're down in the trenches with the poor people. That'd be part of it. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, and so then this is kind of the environment then in which these nuns in Compiègne were living within this kind of political, socio-economical reality.
Definitely.
And they were even seen in some ways. I mean, well, actually, maybe first a first question would be like, where is Compiègne? Where was this monastery?
Oh, it's only about, I think, 50 miles northwest of Paris.
Okay.
Yeah.
So it's kind of in the heart, or close to the heart of a lot of what's going on during this time period.
It's not too long. I think they said at that time one of the nuns, when they had to go see her sick mother, I think they said a 3-hour cart ride to Paris or something like that. So if you do 60 miles, I think it is.
Yeah.
Yeah, I didn't get the exact numbers on that, but
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think that's about right.
Yeah.
But just to show then there was kind of these ties even with this Carmel and perhaps some of the royalty or some of the politics.
The part of it without trying to make very strong distinctions, because all the reality is a little bit mixed. They were called the Royal Carmel, but the only reason for that was the court had many palaces that they used to go to around. For the 4 years that I was studying in France, I was at a place called Fontainebleau, and that's one of the oldest palaces of the kings of France. That's to the southwest of Paris. This is to the northwest. There was a palace there too, and it was not that far from the monastery. So sometimes the court people, members of the court, would go over and talk with the nuns and all this. They would tell them their troubles and all, they ask for prayers and that. But it wasn't because, and maybe you might have this as a question you on your mind, and allow me to maybe move ahead a little bit.
Yeah.
If they were called the Royal Carmel, well, was it just bursting at the seams with true blue bloods? Not in the least. You see, that was just the nickname for the place because they were close to the thing. What happened, there was one, let's put it this way, I like to call it, it was a mixed group of people from all walks of life, but with a minimum of royalty. As Father Bruno, who wrote a book about their martyrdom, it was called The Blood of Carmel. He put it this way, he says, little blue blood, a lot of red blood. They were killed, okay, but there weren't a lot of, there was only one sister who was, descended from a brother of one of the kings, and she was illegitimate. It wasn't even a true child from his marriage. She's the one who writes an account of all this, and very important for us. We can speak about her later. So there's only one royal person. The rest of them, I loved one of them. Her father was a saddle maker. The prioress, her father worked at the Royal Observatory in the city in Paris. She hails from Paris herself. See, those these are just working people, really.
Yeah.
One had connections with Colbert, who was what you could call the prime minister, but they didn't have that job. He was the first minister of King Louis XIV.
Okay.
So she would have been from nobility, I suppose you could say that. But then all the rest of them, they were all, working people. One man worked at the Paris Stock Exchange. I learned from reading this, I guess, that they had a stock exchange in those days, La Bourse. So, you see, it wasn't, we shouldn't make terrific oppositions.
Right.
See what I mean? People are going to go in there and somehow or other, maybe if they were ever to take over the monastery, get all their jewels and gold and that. No. They were true sisters, daughters of St. Teresa, embracing poverty along with chastity and obedience.
Yeah. And that's a beautiful thing, because it seems, the goal often for our Carmelite monasteries is kind of to be a larger snapshot of the entire culture. And so you have, maybe some people who are more closer tied to nobility or higher class here in the monastery in Compiègne, but you also have the daughter of the saddle maker, and
definitely,
a good variety of women then who are living at this monastery.
Surely, definitely.
Maybe could we just say, I want to just mention a few of the names, just because they might come up, and I think there's a few of the names maybe who are more important, at least the prioress.
Oh, please do.
Mother Teresa of St. Augustine. She's the one we often hear about her, because often in the name, when we're talking about groups of martyrs, usually it's you name one of the martyrs and companions. And so that's often how we hear these martyrs. It's Teresa Augustine, Teresa of St. Augustine, and companions. Yeah, so she's obviously going to be a pivotal figure in this story. Is Teresa of St. Augustine. And maybe I'll mention, you mentioned the one nun who ends up surviving. Thank you. Yeah, there's a good list. The one nun who ends up, she's not martyred, and she's important. Sister Marie of the Incarnation.
Marie of the Incarnation.
Right, because she ends up being important. We'll talk about her later, but she kind of lives to tell the tale of much of what we know is because of her surviving.
Definitely.
Maybe one other name, since Sister Constance is the youngest of the sisters.
The youngest
right?
of the sisters.
She had just entered the Carmel shortly before kind of all of this.
That's right, and hadn't yet made her vows.
Yes, that's right. Well, that's good. Well, I don't know. Yeah, are there any other names?
Well, the other one would be the former prioress, who's the novice mistress.
Yeah,
Henrietta
of Jesus.
Okay. Of Jesus.
Yeah, the former prioress and the novice mistress, who has a big impact in influence in the community, I think.
Definitely.
Yeah. No, that's good. I think it's helpful for me anyways to kind of, obviously we're not going to name all, because at this time there's 21 sisters living in the monastery.
That's right.
So, we don't need to go into all their names, but to have some of the key players there, I think is helpful.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you could say a little then, okay, so, we talked first about the Revolution, and now we talked about the Carmel, but what impact then was the Revolution beginning to have during this time period on the Carmel, on these sisters?
Well, it took the revolutionaries some time to get themselves organized, in a sense, It would be hard to go back to the very beginning of this, because there are many stages involved. But let's put it this way. The king brought together these delegates of the people. It wasn't a true parliament, but what happened was they got out of hand, as it were, and decided to more or less declare themselves a parliament with some kind of real deliberative power. And as a result, what happened was there was a growing opposition, say, to the monarchy itself, all right? But when they came together, they didn't have, a track record as parliament. And so they fell to making a lot of discord among themselves. And so it was all en tâtonnant, the French would say, step by step, trying to find your way. And so everything was, to a certain extent, from even a friendly observer, it was a very messy deal, okay? But then they started, bringing about some of these thoughts that were coming from the Enlightenment. And what they did was they just put a decree saying vows for religious people are no longer valid. This is kind of a form of servitude. And so, boom, all of a sudden, the nuns' vows were not being recognized by the state. Okay? So that's where an inroad came against them, you see. Other things that happened was when things started really, getting bad, the king tried to bolt and get out of the place, and they caught him and brought him back. And that's where the idea of bread comes to the fore. I don't know whether you ever heard this thing, but they were singing, "We've got the baker and the baker's wife and the baker's boy," because the Dauphin, which was the crown prince, he was with them trying to get out. So they were brought back. Eventually, things really got so bad that they decided to what? Decapitate, cape. They used the name of the ancient name of the lineage of the French kings, the Capets. He was killed, and then later in the year, Marie Antoinette was sent to the guillotine. The guillotine, I don't know, it's maybe not necessary to explain all that. It had turned out as being somewhat of a humane form of execution, because before that you had people with these horrible old axes, and they wouldn't always plant the axe in the right spot, and it would take several, strokes to kill the poor prisoner. It was devised by a doctor. The name of the guillotine was a Dr. Guillotine, and so that was erected, and the king had to go, and then so Marie Antoinette went too. That kind of stuff can only bring about a degradation of the relationships of, remember the people, we said the third level, okay? The third estate against clergy and also the royalty, the nobility. Okay?
Yeah. You mentioned, that they passed something basically saying that the nuns, their vows were no longer valid, and they can, no longer make vows in the monastery. But we had mentioned Sister Constance earlier. There's a just kind of interesting timing here, because she had just entered, she was clothed in the habit, and she was prepared to make her vows. I think it was in December, and then it was like October when they passed this, basically saying no more vows.
That's it.
So of course she continue living there, and in the monastery, but she wasn't. There was no future from her perspective as far as hoping, to be able to make her vows.
It's true. I don't think we have too much with witnesses, eyewitness that would tell us what she was saying, felt to her, but she would have been like, stuck.
Stuck.
But see, aside from stuck, though, that would be one of the points I would make later on about what the heritage and the meaning of them would be for modern times. There was a lot of solidarity among those nuns. They did. You can find reasons to see creases, some people were of one opinion or another, but they all did stay together,
Yeah.
that was certainly the case of her.
Right.
Yeah. So she could have just bolted and gone.
Yeah.
So I'm not even a part of them yet, so why am I hanging around?
Yeah.
Okay? Yeah.
Yeah, and we'll talk more about this too, but I think so we mentioned that there's 21 nuns. I think 2 of the nuns were extern sisters, meaning I think they were paid, basically. They were paid by the community to run errands and things like this. But again, that's something very beautiful about this is when the kettle started boiling over, these sisters stayed very faithful. They wanted to remain
They did,
with the community, even though they weren't part of the choir sisters necessarily. They hadn't made vows. They were paid employees, but they felt this kind of familial connection with the rest of the nuns.
Yeah. Soiron, I think, was the name of the family.
Yeah. I think that's a beautiful point you make about kind of banding together in the midst of this persecution that they were experiencing.
Yeah. Even though when the government really got after them, they were split up into small groups. See, but that was imposed upon them.
Yeah.
See.
Yeah. Could you say something about, because at the same time then there was they instituted a sort of like constitutional church as well, didn't they? There was sort of a parallel church.
Well, what happened was, I'm not so sure I would know about, say, structures of another group Bing. But what they did was they made the clergy swear allegiance to the state. There was a constitution document. I've never read it, so I can't go into all it stipulated. But the Constitution for the clergy, they were supposed to swear then allegiance to France, and they broke their obedience to Rome. See, there's always been a strong anti-Roman attitude by France regards to the Vatican. They speak of the rights of the Gallican Church, the French Church, and so a little of that was being pushed into this thing too. And they said, "You're going to swear allegiance to us," but some of them they realized that you can't just be a Catholic and not have the Pope, and so they didn't swear. So you had swearing priests, the ones who took the oath and the others who didn't.
Yeah.
Whether or not see, there wasn't a lot of time in all this that they set up a whole big different church. Not quite that. Even it goes even worse. I'm getting away from the idea of church as such, but what did they do with the church building? It was to promote the secularization of France, getting it away from the control of the church. And therefore, I don't know whether they made a church of their own, but what they did was they put up new symbols and new rituals. They got rid of the regular calendar. They had a 9-day week, okay, instead of 7. That was just to say, we don't want the old thing.
Yeah.
And then what did they do? They crowned a prostitute, I think she was, the poor lady there, on the altar of Notre Dame Cathedral as the goddess of reason. It was supposed to be reason, not just faith, not accepting. So that was working against the church as we know it. Whether they set up another church, that's I'm not certain about that, okay?
Yeah, well, you hit on, the good point there was that they were forcing these clergy to swear allegiance to the revolution,
Definitely,
basically.
definitely.
And those priests who wouldn't were then kicked out of France.
Yeah.
And that was their kind of the choice that they had to make. And
definitely.
it sounds like at first, there was maybe a little delay where the Vatican didn't respond right away, and so some of the priests thought maybe
there was
it's okay.
uncertainty. There was,
It's a sticky situation. Do I have to give in somewhat to what the government's saying so we can continue being priests here,
Sure.
or do I stand up and get kicked out and leave the poor people on their own?
It would have been a very, very terrible moral choice for them to make.
Yeah.
Because they would think, well, who's going to take care of the flock
Yes.
if I go? Sure, that's what you could expect. They were thinking. For
Yeah,
sure.
yeah, and so kind of the temperature is just like slowly being turned up here, where
It is, yeah.
it's like at first maybe the government's being a little more accepting of the church, but then as things go on, it's like they keep making inroads, keep overstepping, limiting what things the church can do, what they can
Correct,
say, who
yeah.
can belong, and all this. And so the nuns are kind of in the midst of this.
They are, yeah. I don't know if it would be running ahead in whatever type of a chronology you might have, but when they actually were expelled from their monastery, they were not allowed to wear their habits. They had to put civil garb for women of the place, of the times. See, so that was another thing.
Right.
Secularization.
Yeah.
They hung on to them. They hung on to the habits, but the thing was they couldn't wear them.
Right. Yeah, and even before that, I guess there was eventually an act where the government basically claimed they confiscated all property owned by the church,
Sure,
and
it was
all the
taken.
possessions
Yeah,
within
exactly,
the monastery. So for a time, it's like the nuns were still allowed to live there, but they could no longer take vows. They didn't technically own any of the things in their monastery, but they were still kind of living their life, and that maybe lasted for a time. But then again, as the temperature was turned up more and more,
That's
eventually,
right.
I think this was 1792 is when they were finally expelled from their monastery.
Yeah, and they were told to live in things called associations. What they were was basically apartments large enough to take the sisters involved in homes, which would, I guess, the government rented from the owners. They were lucky enough to be all centered around the local parish of St. Antoine, St. Anthony's, so they could go to church every morning to Mass.
Yeah.
but they just looked like, regular peasant women, women of the town.
Yeah.
And they were supposed to sort of take a low profile so nobody would then object to the fact that they were just really being subversive in staying together.
Yeah.
That was it. And that's what catches up with them later on.
Right.
I mean, not going to Mass, but the fact that they were still devoted, religious-minded people.
Right. Yeah, because it seemed like maybe the goal of the revolution was not just to stamp them out instantly, but to almost like smoke them out very slowly, to start taking away the things that matter and hope that they'll just kind of begin enter society and forget about their religious vows and their religious
it's probably that I don't know, that you'd want to get a very well-written history of the revolution and see whether the author would invoke that type of a thing, a waiting game.
Yeah.
You see what I mean? I don't mean to say that to correct what you're saying, but that's what comes to mind.
Yeah.
How long, and did they actually plan it to be that way, figuring that the position of those against them would be eroded? Or, I don't know, you see. But then things did happen. I mean, there was, in September of 92, I think it is, there were terrible massacres in Paris of clergy. And I had mentioned this earlier on, by a strange quirk of fate. The monastery of the Carmelites in Paris today has been transformed over time to become the Catholic Institute. So I was going to school in buildings that were part of our old monastery. Okay? And this is the place where made famous previous century before by Brother Lawrence of the Resurrection. So I actually saw where his kitchen was, but that's silly stuff, I suppose. Anyway, it was big enough then to be used as a prison. So it got the nickname the Carmelite prison, La Prison des Carmes. And so when they did a roundup of the local clergy in the area, nearby was a very, very famous parish, St. Sulpice, which is about has the second largest church in Paris. I think it's very, very large. Very, very influential, rich, and all the nobility went there. They loved the place. They dragged them over to the Carmelites, and there they set up a tribunal, and they said death, 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 death. And they no sooner would get out the door, there were 2 steps down, and the people were waiting there with all sorts of axes and swords and all this and that. They didn't get a couple of steps into the garden, and they were gone. And they said that the Carmelites up above could hear all the screams.
Wow.
Strange to say, and I haven't studied this, they didn't touch the Carmelites. It's just possible, and this should not become an exercise in triumphalism, right? But perhaps they were of a humble, approach in their lifestyle. And they didn't harm the Carmelite friars. Then I think they just got out of town when it was convenient to leave the place. So we had a place that was called the Carmelite prison, and the massacres, and that's when things, you're talking about the temperature rising. It's getting worse.
Right.
They kill the king or if they kill the queen, then they're going after the other people, you see.
And the time when the nuns are finally expelled too, there was a significant date for the nuns. It was on September 14th.
14th, yeah. Exaltation of the Holy Cross.
Right, and certainly that symbolism wouldn't have been lost on the nuns.
Oh, not on the Carmelite nuns, of course not. No. Who knows what they would have said? We're supposed to begin the fast today. Now we have to fast from our very existence, our very identity.
Yeah.
Will we come out on the other end? Will there be an Easter to this?
Yeah, and they saw themselves really as going to the cross in a way too. So,
as well.
Carrying their cross. And you mentioned a little about the kind of the structure here. So the nuns, they're going to be living outside the monastery in 4 different groups, kind of separated, living in different houses, but then coming together at the local parish, walking to the local parish for daily mass. So they're still able to continue some semblance of a religious life, and certainly interiorly, but a lot of the externals were kind of stripped away from
them. Very much so, yeah. And then, too, not only were they able to feel that there was some kind of contact, or spiritual or otherwise, but it was a couple of months after they were thrown out that the prioress proposed to them the vow, an oblation to offer their lives, as had happened in other times in the church's history, for the well-being of their country and the spiritual well-being of their country, so that the church would regain freedom and it would be left in peace. See, they're putting their lives on them. It was a vow of martyrdom.
Yeah.
Okay? And she got the word through her own group, her own association, then it went around, and they all came around to the idea. Some of them were a little bit shocked by the whole thing and were reticent. They had to come back and they begged her forgiveness, but they all came on board with that vow. And it was repeated daily from the 27th of November of that year, every day until they died.
Until their martyrdom. Yeah, so it's kind of this is a year and a half before their martyrdom.
It's about 2 years, I think.
Yeah, so you got a whole kind of interior spiritual preparation that they're making by offering their lives in this way.
Definitely, yeah.
Yeah, I might read a small section here. I guess we haven't really mentioned this book yet. I'll say something about this book.
That's true. I was going to say, when you asked me about what the impact of the revolution, if you read chapter 5 in the book there, it's called The Impact of the New Order.
Ah, okay.
And that tells you what's going on out in society and how it's eventually going to catch them too.
Right. Yeah, and this book
is William Bush, yeah.
Yes, yeah, To Quell the Terror, the true story of the Carmelite Martyrs of Compiègne by William Bush. And this is a book that we sell here at ICS Publications. It's a great read. I think I've read it. I think I've read it 3 times now, and it's not just like a bland history. He has a real kind of narrative, engaging way, I think, of telling the story of these nuns, really getting into who they were as people and tying together a lot of different threads. So I found it's an entertaining book to read.
Very much so, yeah.
Yeah.
And he has many a spiritual consideration.
Yes.
Oh, he knows Carmel. Yeah, he does.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll just read a section of this, then, because it kind of shows forth what I was saying too about the way that he writes. But we're talking here about them coming together to make this act of martyrdom or consecration.
Oh, good. Yeah.
And so he talks a little bit about what this is kind of William Bush imagining what it might have been like for the nuns, because we don't know all the details necessarily.
No.
But he writes, if we imagine the community renewing their daily act of consecration following one of those early morning daily masses at St. Antoine's in the autumn of 1792, an indelible impression emerges. In a country rent by radical revolution, this small community of 19 outcast nuns, stripped of their habits and clothed in unfashionable second-hand civilian clothes, daily offered themselves to God in holocaust, body and soul, with such meticulous attention that scoffers would have found it all ridiculous. Their shoulders and bosoms covered by large cast-off scarves, their heads enclosed by nondescript cast-off bonnets, they pronounced their daily act of consecration in hushed but distinct and insistently articulated voices, totally indifferent to the scorn of the world. Like incense, their voices rose towards heaven from their half-hidden side altar in the church, gently pervading the semi-darkness of the early morning hour. Far from the eyes of a busy world, and indeed almost invisible to it, these hidden souls, consumed by their love for Jesus Christ, were participating in a divine drama, the only drama that really matters for Christians. I just think he has a very beautiful and poetic way of saying that.
It catches up with us where we were in the sort of the evolution of where they were. I mentioned the St. Antoine and all that.
Yeah.
They did it every day.
Yeah. And also, he mentioned there in that passage there was 19 nuns, and so that's something to point out too. We had said there were 21 originally, and by this point, 2 of the sisters had died, just of old age or sickness, natural causes, I guess we'd say. But there are still 19 of the nuns now living in these four.
Then they're going to lose 3 more.
Yes,
because it's 16 now canonized saints.
Right.
16, yeah.
Yeah. Well, okay, so maybe we can move on then to the next stage in this development. So we have, they're in their monastery, then they're expelled from the monastery. They live in this kind of outside the monastery, more hidden way for, I think it's 22 months. That they live. It's quite a time. I mean, almost 2 years.
Yes.
But then again, the temperature just continues to rise, and this is something you mentioned before. But eventually, Louis XVI is killed.
That's right.
Which this is, I mean, this is.
It's in '93. The
yes,
first
1793.
In January of '93.
Just to point out how, I mean, yeah, ground shaking this would have been at the time. There were over 1,000 years of monarchy in France.
That's right. Exactly.
So this is a whole new order that's being ushered in with this first republic that comes at the death of Louis XVI. And the new calendar, which you mentioned. One thing that's striking, I think, from William Bush's book as well, is he talks about how that Christmas, for the first time, none of the bells rang.
Oh, look at that.
Yeah, none of the church bells rang at Christmas anymore. So it's just like religion is kind of being pushed aside as a sort of afterthought during this time. And then this begins to what we've referenced here, but is known as the Reign of Terror.
That's correct. Yeah.
And this is kind of just like the daily sort of decapitation of anyone who's at all seen as a threat to the revolution.
And with so much regularity that it became almost an aphrodisiac for certain people. There was regular cheering crowds that would come along, and and it just make life miserable for the poor, terrified people who are going to be killed. Yeah. It's a sad, sad scene. La canaille. It's the crowd. The crowd would show up. They of course went along with the revolution because it became a type of a thing where anybody could show up above on the scaffold, ready to have their head chopped off. And in fact, along the way, you've heard of names, and I haven't done extra study about it, but Martyrs. These are people who were some of the leaders. They were killed during the terror.
Right.
Yeah. See, and so along come our Carmelite nuns as well.
Yeah. Yeah, it's something. I mean, you mentioned kind of how the guillotine here is supposed to be this humane,
it's supposed to be
fair way of killing, but I just can't imagine the whole scene of this is done in this the city center, in a public place.
Definitely, yeah.
And people come around to watch, and they're killing 20, 30 people in a day,
That's right.
one after another. It's just it's hard for me to imagine that the society kind of embracing this reality.
Could I bring you forward to another Carmelite person that we all know and like a lot, Saint Therese? The man that she prayed for before she entered Carmel, Pranzini, he was guillotined. He was, and they made chalk heads of them for a museum which was studying what they felt at the time was a bit Malthusian, these types that would lead a person to be more a criminal than another. It'd be racial, unfortunately. And so they would take the head after it had been chopped off and make a cast.
Wow.
A copy of that was sent to the Carmel of Lisieux years later, around the time of her birthday, and I just happened to be visiting the monastery when it arrived.
Oh my gosh.
Yeah, the sister was so surprised.
Yeah.
We were talking in the speak room, and she was called out, and she comes in with a pail. She says, "Look at this," and I went, "Oh,
wow,
Pranzini." But you see, as late then as Therese's life, when there was no such thing as outright persecution against the church, criminals were dispatched by the guillotine.
Yeah. Actually, I read something recently that said that I think France hasn't had a public execution since maybe the 70s.
Yeah.
It was either 70s or 80s. But the last one was with the guillotine. That's what they used.
Did they use it?
So that was their method of execution up until they finally have stopped that, thank God.
Look at that, Look at that. Yeah, interesting.
Yeah, it is.
Oh.
So to return to our dear nuns, though, so they're living in these 4 communities, and then finally they're arrested.
Correct, yes.
This is in June of 1794.
94, yeah,
Right.
yeah. What happened was they, I don't know what unleashed the act that the mayor got going, but they went and they checked where they were staying, and they were finding what they claimed were evidence that they were still in favor of the king, and that they also were being devout, so therefore they were against the idea of that they shouldn't be living a vowed life, that they shouldn't be religious-minded. They was just supposed to be citizens,
Right.
see? And so they put together a sort of a bill of gripes against them and sent it to Paris.
Yeah. And maybe I'll read just a section of that, because one reason I think it's interesting is you could think, well, maybe they were arrested because they had political ties or because they were, involved in a political way. But what is actually found against them is really the fact that they're more than anything, they're trying to live their religious life.
Correct,
I mean, they're
yeah.
truly martyrs for the faith because
That's
they're
true.
trying to
Yeah.
to live their life. This is just like you said. This is the document from Compiègne that's explaining to Paris why it is that the nuns are being arrested. It says, "For a long time now, we have suspected that the former Carmelite nuns of this city, though lodged in different houses, were still living as a community and following the rules of their former convent. Our suspicions were not in vain. Several thorough searches carried out in their houses produced a highly incriminating correspondence. Not only would they put a stop to the progress of the public spirit by receiving persons whom they admitted to a so-called scapular fraternity, but they also expressed wishes for the counter-revolution, for the destruction of the republic, and for the reestablishment of tyranny, as you may judge by the 31 items we join herewith."
Look at that, yeah.
So the evils of the scapular confraternity here.
Yeah, that's really
They
something.
seem to think they were like these grand conspiracy theories against the revolution.
Well, you see, in a way, I could see why they were trying to substitute the things like devotions that the church had kept going for centuries, with their own sets of different things. Now, I don't know what it was in the way of, say, clothing, except maybe the Phrygian hat. That was supposed to be a revolutionary thing. It was a red type of a stocking cap that they put on. They made the king wear it, for instance, before they killed him off. They had symbolism, and so something like that would be a counter-symbolism, maybe not directly across against something else a person wore or not, but still it was falling back away from what they were now presenting to people.
Right.
See,
And a sign of where your allegiance was, because same for the Sacred Heart. That
Sure.
was the Sacred Heart was seen as this symbol of the Catholics that was
Sure would be
the
that.
revolutionaries really didn't like.
Definitely. Oh, Sacred Heart badge.
Yeah.
Did you know in the Hemingway's novel, at the very end, the American takes aim at a fellow coming up, a cavalryman coming up to him from Navarre, and he says he takes aim, and what he helps him aim is the Sacred Heart badge the guy has on.
Wow.
Funny that you would mention that.
Yeah.
See, there again, devotion, that counted for a lot.
Yeah.
Nowadays, in a sense, maybe that's not so prevalent in our modern society, but because it was a changeover from. They were trying to get rid of the old, and so they would be afraid that this would be slipping back if they were going to be giving scapulars out.
Yeah. Yeah. Exactly.
And of course, it catches our attention as Carmelites because we have that devotion very dear. We hold it very dearly. Yeah.
So the nuns are arrested here, and then they're brought to a prison, right?
They send the letter to Paris. Paris sends it back by about 3 days afterwards. And with
But
that...
in the meantime, though, while this is all happening, they're in a prison as well, right?
Oh, a prison. No, what happened is they're sent, definitely. They're sent to, was a monastery of the Visitandines, the Visitation Sisters. So it become prison, just like the Carmelites became a prison in Paris. There they met some captive Benedictine sisters. A little bit of history on that. They were Benedictines from England. Carmel in England was banned as well. So there was an English Carmel in Belgium, what is today Belgium, so that young women could train to become Carmelite nuns speaking English and have freedom of cult, their religion. That's how some of our Carmelite nuns here in America, they had to go to Europe to train to become Carmelite nuns. It wasn't allowed here. Well, they were allowed to live eventually, it's true, but okay. So that's what these Benedictine nuns were in the place too, a visitation convent.
Yeah. And so they met each other, but there maybe wasn't a lot of correspondence because of language difficulties, and also the guards didn't want them perhaps corresponding with one another. But still, they would have spent these few days together.
They did. Yes, they did. Oh, yeah.
Yeah, and again, in part because of the witness of these nuns, we know some more of the details. These Benedictines,
Definitely.
we know some detail. This is how we know some of the inside details about what was happening during this time period.
Because they were released. They weren't killed.
Right.
They were supposed to be killed, but they let them, and they went back to England, and they founded their own monastery in England, and they keep very, very dear memories and also some relics from clothing that they took with them.
Yeah. And then you were saying before then, so this part of the document that I read, this is sent off to Paris.
That's right.
While they're waiting.
The answer came back. They said, send them so that we can try them.
Yeah.
And so they left. It was an overnight trip. It was from one day to the other. They got as far as a place called Saint-Ly by midnight, and then they went on. Where they were sent to was the prison on the same island in the Seine River that Notre Dame Cathedral stands, because there's a royal palace there, and part of it called the conciergerie, which would be the what do you call it? The organizational part of the the palace. Previously was where Marie Antoinette was imprisoned before she went and was beheaded. So they went to the same place, and they stayed until they were ready for the trial. The trial was so efficient that they didn't even, there was no more time after that. They brought them in, they declared them enemies of the state, and they said, you're going to be dispatched, and off they went to the guillotine.
Yeah, could you say something, the story about when they're leaving Compiègne, what are they wearing?
Well, see, that's connected to the Benedictine sisters. Yeah. The mayor was a kind man in his own way. He let them, not knowing that there was going to be the summons to go to Paris at the time, there was time for them to clean their clothing. So what happened was all of the civil garb was in these tubs of water. And Paris says, send them. And of course, he doesn't want to make Paris upset by not getting them out. So what are we going to do? So he said, you'll just have to use your monastic garb, and then these sisters here, the Benedictines, can have your clothes. Okay, and that's how they took them to, when they were freed, they went over to England with some of them. Okay, right. So they actually had their Carmelite habits. And that's how they actually went to the scaffold. Right. But one little thing I'd like to say, because I'm a stickler, I'm afraid, most of the paintings that you see of the Carmelite nuns going up the staircase to the Iron Maiden, or whatever they call, what the nickname might have been, the guillotine, it shows them with veils. They didn't have veils on. They had those caps that you quoted earlier on, the peasant caps. Right. And it was very, very, what shall we say, ironically dire state that the caps are in, because they were told to cut off the bottom part all across so that it wouldn't block. Now, very impossible for it to block the blade as it came down, but they wanted that to be a clear shot, so they had these modified little bonnets. That's how they went up. Yeah. They didn't have their veils on, but they had habits on. And I doubt, I shouldn't say I doubt, I'm unsure as to whether they might have had mantles on.
Often they're depicted with mantles on, but We don't necessarily know.
Part of it would be perhaps, too, it's the middle of the summer. They might have been, they said we can excuse ourselves having to wear them. I don't know. But the thing about the veils was that's not accurate.
Right.
Because it would have gotten in the way. It would have made the work of the executioners that much harder. And they were very demanding. They would tell you how you'd be ready to go.
Right.
Okay?
Yeah. And like you said, this was all happening very fast. I mean, they arrived in Paris, they're tried, and then that very same day. So they're brought. It's funny, the name of the courtrooms, is something that's just was very striking to me. Is they were tried. There was the courtroom of freedom, and the courtroom of equality. That was the name of the two courtrooms that were sentencing all these people to death. And so they were tried there on July 16th, and that very same day, then, like you said,
No, on the 17th.
Oh, the 17th, yeah. And then, and like you said, had been brought to the guillotine that day. One little story I like from this is that the prioress is still, she comes across as just very motherly, really looking after her nuns the entire time. And they had woken up very early, and they'd spent a lot of time in the day like standing and waiting different places, and they go and they're tried, and then they're sentenced. They're brought back to the jail before they're taken away to be killed. And the mother, she wants to care for her sisters, and so they sell some piece of clothing or coat that they have.
One of the nuns, see, this is why Bush is great on details.
Yeah.
Sometimes, though, you don't know. You wish he did a little bit more. What he says is one of the nuns had with her a fur wrap. Now, why she would have had a fur wrap this far down the line after all the pushing around, but she did.
Yeah.
And she bartered that for a cup of hot chocolate for each of the nuns.
Yeah.
It's a strange, and it's touching in its
is.
own way.
Kind of their last meal together as a community as they drink this chocolate before they go off to be
and it
killed.
certainly would have helped them because they would have been standing in these carts, the timbrels they call them. They'd be standing in there for everybody to see them and all that. So you have to be holding on. Some of them are very old. It must have been terrific, and you got summertime.
Yeah.
Although in Paris, you don't always have hot, sunny days, but at any rate,
And so then they're brought.
Well, thank you for that story. I didn't want to bring it up because I said, how in the world did she end up with a fur wrap?
Yeah.
But they were hanging on to whatever they could, I guess.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of them even had a prayer book, I think, at this point, who she handed off to someone on the street.
That's probably
on the way to the guillotine. But also, so as they're being brought, then it's recounted that they're singing things.
That's right. Yeah.
Perhaps the Salve Regina, they're singing together as they're riding. They might have been praying the office for the dead or saying prayers in preparation.
Well, that's it. We owe to Bush a good knowledge of the liturgical lore. He said that they start with the Miserere. See, this would be the office for the dead, preparation for a soul to die, and then calling on the Holy Spirit, Veni Creator. The Salve Regina was there as well.
Right.
It was also Laudate Dominum.
Yes.
Praise the Lord. All right.
Yeah. So you can just imagine this scene, right? Of these, because these are open carts.
That's right.
And here you're just witnessing these nuns dressed in their habits, chanting these Latin hymns, being led to their death.
Yeah, which the people would have understood because, French is close to Latin, and they would have had the Mass in Latin. And those people were recent converts to the New Order. They were Catholics. They would have known. And that leads to the other thing, which is always pointed out. There was a very, very strange, haunting quiet when they went by. And that goes against what I told you about la canaille, the crowd, rooting to scare them and to see the people, the poor victims react. They just couldn't figure out what is going on. These women are going up there.
Yeah.
See, these holy women.
Yeah.
So, and to my knowledge, there were no other large groupings of, say, religious who were killed. I must admit my ignorance of the full range of the terror. But at any rate, this was something else.
Yeah. Could you say something then? Okay, so they arrive at the the guillotine. Can you kind of walk us through, like, what's the last little bit of the story?
Yeah,
there?
well, with that's the thing where, with the way we in a religious life, a consecrated life today, actually practice our vows, when it comes to obedience, we sometimes avail ourselves of distinction, saying, well, I can do interpretive, obedience. My superior wouldn't mind it if I stayed a couple of extra hours somewhere where I'm, because I'm out of the monastery. But they went to the prioress and said, permission to die. And she gave them permission.
Yeah.
So it was a communal action going through the mother figure. The figure for them was actually the Christ figure. I mean, she's the convener of the group.
Right.
And she had with her a small little statuette of the Blessed Mother, which nobody could see. It was so small. It's only about 2 inches high. And they kissed it, and then up they went.
And we still have that statue.
I saw it in the monastery of Compiègne today.
Because the prioress handed it off to someone before.
Then she gave it to somebody in the crowd, and I don't know the history of how they're sure they have it, but that's what happened. Yeah.
And then also, I think the nuns were renewing their vows before they died as well, or at least the Sister Constance made her vows.
Well, she made her vows, but I don't know if they had to.
Well, I think that's something William Bush mentions. But,
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Very good. Very good.
But yeah, so Sister Constance, this young nun who we said was in her novitiate, but she couldn't make her vows because the revolution had prevented that. Here, right before she dies, she kneels down before the prioress and makes her vows.
profession. Yeah.
And then they go up, the nuns go up one by one.
One by one. And the
it's
prioress
quick.
remains to the end. Now, one of the sisters on top, this is one where I have a text I would like to read into our little record,
Yes.
if you want to call it that, is one of the oldest. And what she did was she said to the man, I think there were probably 2 executioners, but to the one of them she says, I forgive you, my friends. So that's for both of them. All right? But then what does she add? She said she had a second thought, and she said this, I forgive you with all the longing of heart with which I would that God forgive me. I said to myself, isn't this something? They're talking about fraternity. This woman, ready to be able to sort of she could have thumbed up her thumb at him and say, I'm going to heaven. I'm sure you're going the other direction. Did she say that? No. She says, I'm a sinner, and I'm hoping God's going to forgive me, just as I'm really willing to forgive you.
Yeah.
It's extremely spiritual and theological thought in those words.
Yeah, it's
and affirming, as it were, then equality with the guy. And that's what the revolution was supposed to be for. Liberté, égalité, fraternité. They were not considered, there was no fraternity for them. They were going to be excluded. But she got them on égalité.
Yeah.
It's beautiful.
It is.
And she was one of the 2 who balked at the first time that they were proposed to take the vow, to do the oblation for martyrdom. But then she changed her mind.
Right.
So it's a real beautiful little story how that worked.
Yeah.
That's one thing. There was nothing else particular about any of the sisters, I don't think, except as we just said, they kissed the thing and asked permission, and then they kissed the thing and up they went.
Right. Yeah, and William Bush also recounts that one of them began singing the Laudate Dominum Omnes Gentes. So this is Psalm 117.
Correct.
A very short psalm, but they began chanting it.
It's chanted at one of the offices of night office, Compline, once in the week.
Yeah. So this is the psalm. Then the Psalm 117, like you mentioned, it was prayed at Compline, but also that in the Carmelite tradition would have been sung at the time the election of a new prioress or the foundation of a new monastery. Back from the time of Teresa. So here they were kind of marking this new beginning.
It's a beginning.
On their way to heaven. Yeah. So this is July 17th, 1794.
That's correct.
When our sisters are killed. And somewhat miraculously, then the reign of terror ends there just 10 days later.
10 days later.
Which many people have looked back and kind of seen. Again, this was the spiritual, the act of martyrdom and consecration that the nuns had been making for the good of their country, finally handing over their lives for the good of their country.
For several years.
Yeah, and this marked the end of the reign of terror. One thing we mentioned before, because I want to say something now kind of about the enduring legacy then of the Martyrs of Compiègne. What did they say for us today, but also how have they been received throughout time? And we mentioned one thing that was very important is there was the one sister, Marie of the Incarnation, who happened to be away at the time. She was taking care of some family business. So she was away when the nuns were killed. And in large part because of that, we have so many of the details about the story of these sisters. And so she, later on in her life, she wrote a history, which is kind of maybe the first written source, real dense written source of the story of these nuns. But then from there, their story continued on in the realm of not only history, but also the arts.
Different formats were adopted by people to talk about the story of the martyrs. One was a small novella by a German called Gertrude von der Fort, The Song at the Scaffold. The very important and still perennial reminder to society at large of them is the opera, The Dialogue of the Carmelites, was composed by the French composer Francis Poulenc, and he also wrote the script or the libretto for it. It premiered in 1950, I think it was. He made strict orders that whenever it was played, it had to be presented. It had to be done in the vernacular. Yeah, so it was in Italy, whereas the world premiere was in Italian. Let that go. The technical side is not so important.
And that was based on something written by
George Bernanos.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. He had done a screenplay, but it didn't get to the shape of a movie right yet. And Bernanos then Poulenc inspired himself of it. And contrary to the usual way things happen, he didn't have a librettist to do it. He wrote it himself. So he did the music and the terminology. I was invited by the New York City Opera to give a talk on this opera to they would be the backers board. These are the big rollers, money people who were supporting it. And I'd like to just give you the 4 points that I thought I thought at the time would interest them as to why this particular opera is of help to us and what it stresses. And strange to say, getting ready to speak with you about this evening, I've come up with 6 others.
All right.
Yeah. You see, I told them that one thing, to use somewhat modern categories, it shows, it displays how state intolerance can gang up on the people they're supposed to serve. That's one thing. Yeah. But then there's also the idea that personal destiny, if a person really wants to follow their star, it can win out even against a lot of adversity. And that's the person who is only fictional in the opera, Blanche de la Force. She's the one who dies with the other sisters. Okay. Finally, it's fidelity against fanaticism. These people were faithful to their calling in life, regardless of all the pressures that were coming at them from all sorts of angles. The idea that they were setting up a whole new religion, that they were trying to establish what they claimed were freedoms, which were going against the freedom of their own lives, which they had embraced earlier on, before the revolution started. Finally, what support you can get from being in a group. It's helping each other forward. And that's what happens at the end of the opera. People realize, they say, wow, they all did it. Nobody left the others. You See, okay, that was for them then. But since then, I've come across these other thoughts that come to mind. One would be that there's resistance against state terrorism through love. It's almost, it just comes to mind right now, maybe I'm throwing too much in there, but it's a little bit, the idea of Martin Luther King Jr., nonviolence, love beats state terrorism. Yeah. We're talking about them right now. I don't think too many people are, daydreaming about Robespierre and Marat and those guys. I don't think so, right? But then also, they stand for the defense of contemplative, consecrated life. That's something that they wanted. They said, we don't want to leave this. Yeah. You're not going to make us do this, you see? And they hung in, even though it was in a different form, with their little bonnets on instead of the veils. Then there's religious freedom. Should be protected. That's true liberté. And these guys were saying liberté, but they were imposing a certain kind of liberté which wouldn't allow the other. See? And that's certainly a common concern of a lot of people nowadays. How does religious freedom survive with a lot of the regimes in this world of ours? Okay? That's what these nuns can symbolize. Yeah. Another one, it's how can we counter secularization? Because what they were doing was they were saying, we're going to dismantle all these kind of usages, which are your religious ones, which are not even embraced by the whole of society. Not every, they weren't all practicing Catholics, but they wouldn't leave them alone. Well, this is a countersign to that idea of secularization by saying we will still want to be faithful to what we professed. Yeah. Another thing is altruism for one's country. They gave a vow which was supposed to bring peace to France. They weren't saying, what shall we say? They didn't put their terminology along the lines of saying, let's overthrow the revolution. Just give peace to France, you see. And they were peaceful people about it. Yeah. The sister forgives her executioner up at the top of the stairs. Think of that again. And then finally, there's strength that comes from communal commitment. Strength come for the individual, and together they give strength to each other. Yeah. And that would have been something probably that would have contributed a little bit to the silence the day that they were going through. People said, the French would say, chapeau, hats off. They're sticking together through this thing. Yeah. So those are the things where I think it's significant what they did. The significance of that is transportable into our own world today.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. And, because a lot of people could maybe draw parallels in, one country and another about what they see going on in politics and things like that. But I like your focus there on our focus should be on love, loving our God and loving one another. And that's really going to be what will win out in eternity. So, yeah, that's a beautiful. I just want to share a story myself. Those of you who are watching on YouTube will see I have this small guillotine sitting here on the table. And I made my solemn vows on the feast of the Martyrs of Compiègne on July 17th, 2021. And so this was a gift that one of the priests in my community gave me so I could recall the day of my solemn vows, which actually it's kind of a funny thing to have, but I appreciate the symbolism of it too. It's in making this act of consecration, my religious vows. I'm handing over my life to the Lord, to the country, to the church, to the world, that's right, yeah. In love, and that's the same thing that I'm called to replicate that same sacrifice that these martyrs made. So when I see this, it's a good reminder. But a funny story about this. So I received it as a gift at my final vows. After my final vows, I did a little bit of traveling. I was down in Alabama and Louisiana, and then it came time to go back to the monastery. So I got on an airplane, and I didn't think anything of it, but this was in my carry-on. Oh, and Lord. So here I am in the airport going through. With a knife. And they pull my bag aside, and the TSA agent pulls out this little guillotine, and he's sitting there, and he feels it's not sharp. But I'm sitting there thinking, okay, do I try to explain this to him? I would be a whole long story to try to explain why I have this in my bag. In the end, I just keep silent. I say a prayer for him. He puts it back in my bag, and I go on my way. So.
Oh, good. Well, it wasn't sharp.
No, it wasn't an issue, but I was torn. Do I try to explain this to this poor man who's wondering why I have this in my bag?
What kind of a character is this?
Yes, exactly.
Oh, good.
Well, very good. Yeah, I don't know if you have any other closing remarks or maybe anything you would recommend as far as reading or things people might want to watch about the Martyrs of Compiègne, ways they could learn more.
I would just say that not that, but rather what comes next. The Pope has made them all saints.
Yes.
I have been in the order for a vowed life for 60 years, and it's always been Blessed Teresa of St. Augustine and companions. Now it's Saint. I have to say Saint Teresa of St. Augustine, happily. The process is called equivalent canonization or equivalent. Mm-hmm. It's because the fame of sanctity has never faded with them, and that's always one of the three considerations to make a saint, that the Pope felt it was wise to proclaim them saints. Mm-hmm. But when they do that, you don't have a canonization ceremony in Rome. What he does is he makes a proclamation. It's put into what's called a papal bull, and is sent usually to the order if they're religious, so to say this certifies that the Pope has exercised his infallibility, because he's saying they're in heaven, and they are now saints of the Church. Well, if you look at some of the news services, the one from the Vatican said there won't be a celebration in St. Peter's Square, but there will be celebrations in France. And lo and behold, at New Year's, I received a bulletin from the Friends of the Carmel of Compiègne. I've been on their mailing list ever since I visited there as a definitor in the 1990s. And it says, we heard just now that the Pope has done it. And so they're saying the places and dates of celebrations are going to be discussed by the diocesan curias of Paris and Beauvais in the future, so that we'll have something coming.
Yeah.
Okay? So Beauvais is the diocese where Compiègne is.
Okay.
See, so that they got two dioceses are going to be definitely working on it. I'm sure others, these will be very public ones, other dioceses in France will probably also be doing that as well.
Wow.
Yeah.
Yeah, so that's hot off the press then, just...
Yeah. It was postmarked the 27th of December. Yeah, it probably might have been en route when the Pope was making his because they had just sent it from France to me. Yeah. Okay.
Oh, good. Well, very much.
But that's what's to come. I mean,
right.
So keep your eyes out, folks.
Yeah. Excellent. Well, thank you so much, Father John.
Okay, very good.
Yeah.
My pleasure. Very
All
good.
right. We hope that you'll join us for our next episode next week, and know of our prayers for you. God bless you.